Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Love my next guest. Spoke to him first late last year. He is a terrific journalist. He really is. It's a dirty word these days, journalism, but he really is a top man. He is the Parisian correspondent for the American Herald Tribune, and his brand new website is www.gearòid.org. Or Colmàin.org, I should say. I'll tweet that out there for you Philistines who've never spoken or who have never read Irish. Let's welcome him all the way from Paris. Gearòid, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Hi, Richie. Great to be back again. Great to participate again. Grand, yeah, fine. Doing, working away.
Well, thanks.
A lot of stuff to talk about.
We do, and you just said working away, and I do appreciate where you are. It's been a long day. You're following what's been happening in Brussels, so I do genuinely appreciate that you've stuck around to speak to us this evening. Give us your thoughts then, Gearòid. Give us your initial thoughts when you learned what happened in Brussels on Tuesday. What did you think straight away?
Well, I think it was to be expected because, we could have, without any props from, insiders in the global oligarchy, we could have predicted what was going to happen anyway years ago. But there was an article in the French version of the Huffington Post in January, I believe, by a top French Zionist ideologue. His name is Jacques Attali. He was an advisor to successive French governments. And he's definitely, he sits very much at the top of the pyramid in the French political elite. And he wrote an article saying that 2016 was going to be a lot worse than 2015 in terms of terrorism, that terrorism was going to get out of control, that Europe was going to be, inundated with all kinds of problems to do with terrorist attacks, that the security services were not going to be able to deal with it, and so on. And at the same time, that there was the mass migration into Europe was going to accelerate as well. So that you were going to have a massive increase again in the influx of people from the Middle East in particular, but also from, I guess, right across the African continent into Europe in 2016. And with an increase in terrorism, that terrorism was going to get out of control, and there was going to be no end to the wars, such as the war in Syria and all of the other wars that are pretty much ongoing, like the war in Iraq, which never really ended, the war in Libya, which never really ended because these wars are ongoing. These are kind of permanent wars, if you like. They're fires that have never been put out. So it was, this looks like pretty much what he was talking about at that time. And I think that that's essentially what we're seeing. We're seeing there are two main aspects to keep in mind here. One is the strategy of tension, which was a policy implemented by NATO during the Cold War to maintain support for antisocial states in Europe against the possibility of a Soviet threat. And that support for antisocial states was maintained through bombings of civilian targets in Europe by far-right groups in the service of Western intelligence agencies, in particular the CIA, but also Masonic groups, for example, the P2 Lodge in Italy, were deeply involved in this. So the European elite during the 1970s and 1980s were involved in a vast conspiracy against the public to maintain the Cold War. And that was referred to as Operation Gladio. It's been proven to have existed because there are documents to prove that it existed. And in fact, the European Parliament confirmed its existence in 1991 and condemned it. And there is still a process, there are court proceedings against it, but there's rarely any media coverage of it. And Gladio is something that is rarely spoken about, but it has been covered by the BBC. The BBC did an excellent documentary about it. I think it was 1992. The French media refer to it every now and then, discreetly. But Gladio did exist, and Gladio still exists. It's never been, decommissioned. This covert a military intelligence operation. And so I see these attacks as probably being part of that. One never knows, of course, because these ISIS militants, even though they were created by the United States, and we know that from the documents of the United States government itself, and from statements by senior U.S. officials that ISIS or Daesh or ISIL is a creation of the United States. But we have, I think that there are strong indications that Gladio as a geopolitical strategy by NATO has never been disbanded, has never been decommissioned, and that what we're seeing is an escalation of that, bearing in mind that there is a global war going on and that is concentrated in the Middle East right now in Syria, but that is spreading out from Syria into other countries like the North Caucasus, into Central Asia and so on. It's going right through Africa. And this is a colonial war for resources. It's a colonial war of conquest for the richest and most important regions in the world by an oligarchy, crushing the laboring masses, crushing the working class in Europe through austerity. What would you expect from such people?
Yeah.
They have absolute contempt for the public. They have absolute contempt for ordinary people. And people need to wake up because, the more they buy in to their lies and their media propaganda campaigns, the more ordinary people suffer.
And I just mentioned this, terrific, by the way. For anybody who wants to read more about Gladio, Google, I hate saying Google, but use any search engine you want. Look for Felice Casson, who is an Italian judge who wrote about Gladio in the 1990s, I think, the late 80s or early 1990s. And some people credit with really kind of blowing the lid off what Gladio was really all about. It's terrific stuff by Gearòid Colmàin, who's on the programme from Paris, 13 minutes past the hour. Speaking with the terrific Patrick Henningsen on the programme earlier on in the week, and we were talking about some aspects of some outlets in the independent media have almost gone full-scale kind of genuine racism towards people of an Islamic persuasion. And they talk about thousands of jihadists in Europe. We hear what presidential candidate Donald Trump says all the time. No-go areas in European cities and all of that. But I'm sympathetic to something that you said, that is that one of the benefits to those who would control what's going on is that in the migrant flow there will be lunatics that again, you quite rightly said, were funded and trained and set to do their mayhem by the United States, but that they will be. What is your understanding, Gearòid, of how big or kind of how numerous they would be? Are we talking a few hundred? I know this might sound a ridiculous question, but it's so telling at the moment. Some people are saying thousands. Interpol says 5,000. What do you think is the reality?
Richie, I don't know in terms of statistics because I'm not an intelligence agent. I'm not privy to sensitive information in terms of how many of these terrorists are coming across the borders, predominantly from Syria to Turkey and then into Europe. The problem with statistics in terms of terrorism is that the statistics tend to be provided by people who are kind of inside the system and in more cases than not actually complicit in the terrorism. So, you're listening to people like Breedlove from NATO telling you that, there are thousands, if not hundreds of, possibly hundreds of thousands of these. What can you make of it? I mean, you cannot possibly contradict what he's saying because you simply don't know. And of course, how do you know who is a terrorist coming in? If the terrorists are disguised as refugees and as ordinary migrants, then how do you know if he's a terrorist or not? How do you determine whether someone is a terrorist? These intelligence agencies, seem to be privy to all sorts of classified and secret information that the public isn't aware of. And so it's difficult to tell. But I think that if you listen to people like the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who is at least critical of NATO policy in Syria and very critical of US policy in Ukraine, and a little bit more sympathetic to other powers like Russia and China and so on. If you listen to what he's saying, I mean, he does think that there are thousands of ISIS militants coming to Europe. If you listen to what President Assad has said, he also thinks that there are very significant numbers of these ISIS militants coming into Europe because they've basically been defeated in Syria through the Russian intervention and the heroic efforts of the Syrian Arab Army. They've been pretty much routed from Syria. So it is quite possible that they will be redeployed to Europe by their sponsors, by NATO, Israel, and the Gulf Cooperation Council and Turkey into Europe for the purposes of further destabilization. There's a lot of unfinished business in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Balkans. Serbia is unfinished business. It's the anniversary today of the NATO bombing in 1999 of Serbia, where they were set up, and that country was completely destroyed. Of course, Yugoslavia was completely destroyed by NATO on purpose, and it was all by design. And at that time, they used Islamist militants to break up Yugoslavia. It's not well known in the West, but it was one of the first highly publicized, in inverted commas, humanitarian interventions, the 1999 bombing of Kosovo, of Serbia, which pulled away this region of Kosovo, which is now an absolute cesspool of crime and corruption and delinquency and terrorism right in this heart of this region. And this is a former colonial, this is a neo-colonial region, as you know. The Balkans, the Turks ruled there for many centuries. And Turkey's on the move. Turkey is pretty much out of control nowadays. They're openly backing ISIS. They're almost provoking war with Russia. They're using migrants as weapons against Europe to gain concessions into the European Union. Erdogan's Turkey is very much out of control. So there's a lot of tension in the Balkans over this. Macedonia's in big trouble. They fear an ethnic conflagration with the Albanians in their country. There is a NATO policy of recreating Greater Albania as the Nazis did during the Second World War, when they had a policy again of creating Greater Albania. They had Nazi divisions, they had Muslim divisions of the Nazis at the time, the SS Waffen, Skanderbeg and Hamzar divisions were Islamofascists, proto-Islamofascists during the Second World War. And these kind of forces are still there. So I think that people in the Balkans are very worried, in Croatia, in Serbia, in Macedonia. The Hungarians are worried. They don't trust the Turks, of course, and they understand that the Turks are behind Wahhabi terrorism, and they're trying to get into Europe. Of course, if Turkey gets into Europe, the kind of regime that's in Turkey, if they get into Europe, God only knows what kind of disruption they'll cause in terms of the promotion of their death cult.
Can we mention something? Can we mention something on that? By the way, that it's brilliant. You mentioned Turkey now. Gearòid, of course, can be heard on RT regularly, where we first came across him, and he gave absolutely terrific analysis of what happened in Paris. That's why he was on the programme. His interview went viral. I think it was the first time for a long time that people saw on on a very popular programme and a very much watched programme, genuine analysis of what's going on and what happened in Paris. Gearòid, by the way, is the Parisian correspondent for the American Herald Tribune, and his website is www.gearoidcolmán.org, which is being tweeted out now. Now, I did mention RT. Today, RT put what I would call meat on the bones of a story that they began reporting in December, January, I think, and that is the stories that the Turkish government were basically doing oil deals with the Islamic State. And today there was a terrific report which we shared on social media, which was well backed up with documentation and with interviews with former and captured Islamic State jihadists that absolutely nailed, as far as I'm concerned, the proof that the Turkish government and even the family of Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish Prime Minister, have been doing business with ISIS. I mean, Gearòid, it must be sickening for you, a proper journalist, a man who knows his history, who researches his work meticulously, to to see Jeremy Corbyn standing up at Prime Minister's Question Times, there's no mention of this. There are no questions about this. How can we be doing business with a NATO ally that is basically responsible for doing monumental deals with a lunatic terrorist group, deals worth, hundreds of millions of euro? Terrific report by RT today. This is very significant now, of course, isn't it?
It is. I mean, obviously the tension between Russia and Turkey is at an all-time high. These are countries that have, as you know, have had wars in the past. In the 18th century, I mean, they've been at war many times in the past, and kind of geopolitically in conflict over, I suppose, Russia's civilizational kind of influence in Constantinople historically, and the Turkish or sort of Islam or Islamic occupation of Constantinople going back to the 15th century. There's definitely a kind of a tectonic, what would you describe it maybe as a kind of a tectonic fault line there between Russia and Turkey in that region of the world. And the United States have been pushing Turkey as a counterpower to Russia for a long time. They've built them up militarily. Turkey is now said to be one of the most powerful militaries in the world. If you listen to people like George Friedman from Stratford, he claims that they could defeat the French and the Germans in a day. So this is a very significant military force. At the same time, one which has a deeply ambiguous foreign policy. Remember, until 2009, Turkey was playing a very diplomatic card with its neighbours. They had a good neighbourly policy in the region at the time. And Erdogan, for example, was given the Gaddafi Prize in 2010 for his constructive diplomatic role up to that point. And they kind of were quite critical of Israel and so on. And so they were kind of creating the impression that they were going to be some kind of the start of some kind of, I guess, Muslim Renaissance or Islamic Renaissance, and they were maybe going to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, but it was going to be a progressive source of stability in the region. And so they had good relations with Libya, with Syria, with Iran. They were very constructive in 2010 in creating an international mechanism to resolve the nuclear crisis with Iran, and the Brazilians were involved in that as well. And so by 2010, the Turks were looking good. I mean, it was kind of, we were looking at multipolarity. The Russians were pretty happy with that too, because they've all sorts of deals that they need to sign, and they need to have a flexible, pragmatic Turkey. And then once the Arab Spring broke out in 2011, Turkey just went crazy. They completely turned on Libya, even though they'd gotten prizes from them and everything. They completely turned on Libya. They were leasing out Incirlik Air Base to the Israelis. I mean, they just...
What were they promised, Gearòid? What were they promised for that?
I think that they were... I think it's the duplicity of the Muslim Brotherhood, because Erdogan, is a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and if you look at their behavior, they're deeply duplicitous, deeply deceptive in the way they operate. Until the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood were playing a kind of a nationalist card, and they were doing that very much through Al Jazeera TV station. And so they managed to fool a lot of people into thinking the kind of Muslim Brotherhood was some kind of a nationalist, kind of anti-Zionist organization. And then, of course, as soon as the Arab Spring took off in 2011, with full NGO support from the National Endowment for Democracy and a panoply of US NGOs and Israeli organizations, the Muslim Brotherhood showed their true colors, but they had gained sort of credibility through lots of propaganda over the last decade. So the Erdogan regime is really it's a key strategic partner of Israel, and they're kind of bringing about Israel's long-term strategic objectives,
the greater Israel, East,
which is greater Israel, and always has been greater Israel. And like when you look at the war on terrorism objectively, and you kind of follow the pieces of the puzzle to their logical conclusion, it's very clear that the war on terrorism is a Zionist project, and that it is really about creating conditions of a clash of civilizations in Europe and America that would facilitate Israeli hegemony, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world. And I think if you look at most of the terrorist attacks that we've seen, even just starting at 9/11, but you could go back further than that, but even we should start with 9/11, Israel has played a key role. I mean, Israel were all over 9/11. There's no question about it. If you just look at, all of the evidence of Israeli agents who were actually arrested for terrorism in the actual day itself, and the eyewitnesses of Israelis celebrating. I mean, there's lots of, and even the statements of senior officials in U.S. intelligence community, senior military personnel, people like Zabrowski from, the American Army War College. I mean, there's a whole load of people who could, talk about that.
I was late
Israel
to the table,
had a very
Gearòid.
suspicious role in 9/11, and they're the only state that have benefited from the 9/11 wars. All of the wars, the war to destroy Iraq, for example. James Petras wrote a brilliant book about this, about the power of the Israeli lobby in the United States. There's no question that the war in Iraq was not necessary from a point of view of oil or petrol, because most of the petrol was siphoned off anyway. There was a massive account in Paris and BNP Paribas from the oil in Iraq, but it was because they could not tolerate any Arab unity. And so Iraq was the beginning of a long war against all of the Arab regimes to destroy them, break them up, in accordance with the Yinon Plan, which we know was published in 1982, which talks very clearly about this, about the necessity of breaking up and destroying all Arab regimes who could pose a threat to Israel's imperial ambitions in the region. So I think that's something, of course, that's completely absent from the debate. You can talk about Muslims all you want. You can talk about Arabs. I mean, the thing about it is, most people who believe in what they see on the TV and what they hear on the radio about the war on terrorism are Islamophobic, whether they admit it or not. Because, look, if you believe that, young Muslims are committing these acts, right? And if you believe that and you don't see the agenda of Israel, then you are Islamophobic, and you've every right to be Islamophobic, and you should be Islamophobic if you believe that, because if you believe that, then you see obviously the origin of this, and it must be Islam. The problem is it isn't, and once you understand that, instead of saying, oh, it's just a couple of Muslims and these crazy Muslims, but it's not all Muslims. The political correctness that they impose after these attacks about Muslims. Once you understand that it's not just, it's a couple of Muslims and it's these bad Muslims, but not all Muslims, but rather it's a couple of Jews and it's a couple of bad Jews, but not all Jews. That's the real debate here, because I don't see these working class patsies, these delinquents, these, small petty drug dealers, people from poor families. They're not the people driving these wars. They're not the people planning wars. They're not the people sitting in front of computers at NATO headquarters planning the next war against Syria, like the people in London in 2009 who were met by the French foreign minister, Roland Dumas,
that's
who
right.
invited him to participate as they were finalizing a war against Syria, which involved sending jihadi mercenaries into that country. The people like the Kouachis and the Koulibalis and the Abdeslams and the Abouds and all these guys that we see paraded in front of us like slaves in front of our screens, they are just as much victims of this war as all of the innocent people in Belgium, in Paris, and in Iraq, and in Syria, and all these countries. And most of the victims of terrorism, of course, are Muslims. They are just as much victims as everyone else.
Can I come back in on that, Gearòid? First of all, I've got to do a quick time check. It's 1:30 the hour. Gearòid Colmàin is our guest this hour. Let me just interject there. And I'm kind of half being the devil's advocate, but I'm also mindful as well that there are listeners to this programme, because of where it goes out, whom contact me all the time. And they will be listening to this and they will agree with pretty much everything you say. But they will also say, Gearòid is going to say, Well, we've got serious problems with human rights abuses in Britain and in America, which of course we do, grievous miscarriages of justice in our countries, and worse than that, blatant violations of people's human rights. But there will be people who say, Gearòid, look, whether we like it or not, and we can champion Iran and what happened to Iran and how BP and the CIA overthrew Mohammed Mossadegh, we can say all that. But in these countries, there are pockets of 12th, 13th, 14th century kind of bizarre historic kind of forms of justice. There are bad things that go on in some of these places. Now, we could talk about Saudi Arabia. That's a different story entirely. But people will say that. They will say, guys like you and Richie Allen and David Icke and Ken O'Keefe and others, you never speak to that. You never speak to the grave human rights abuses that we know have happened in Iran, for example, in Jordan. We mentioned the Saudis. And we kind of have to acknowledge that as well, don't we?
Oh, I've been in Iran. I traveled extensively in Iran. I met people in Iran who were arrested by the police and beaten up and tortured. I know all about it, and I collaborate a lot with the Iranians, and I'm deeply critical of Iran. I don't agree with everything the Iranians do. I don't agree. I'm not sure, as much as I admire certain aspects of their society. But I'm not sure if I could live there. But I certainly wouldn't buy the Western propaganda about Iran, because I think the country is far more complex than the kind of the Zionist propaganda puts out.
Agreed.
It's a complex society that has merits and demerits, and it's like in any country. Once you get on the wrong side of the government, things can get pretty nasty. I know that French prisons are among the worst in the world. The conditions in French prisons are appalling. You're an Irishman like me. We could talk about British prisons. All of the Irish people who were locked up there when the British government was committing false flag attacks, blaming them on the IRA, and the kind of torture they suffered. That is a fact in most states. That in most states you have all kinds of violations of justice by officials of the state. And Iran is no different. Syria is no different. I'm sure there must have been torture in Syria. I can't imagine there wouldn't have been. I was in Syria in 2011, and I mean, there must have been all kinds of abuses, but nothing like the kind of the propaganda you see in the West about Syria. You have to understand that Syria is actually a democracy. It is a republic. It has a democratic constitution, and there is rule of law in Syria. So this is not a country where if officers pull you out of your bed at 3 a.m. and shoot you in the woods, that's not legal in Syria.
No.
So if that ever happened, then there was a violation of Syrian law. The problem with the West is that they caricature these countries. These are complex countries with all sorts of problems. But what they do is they demonize the country and say that, there's this deep conspiracy of a government killing its own people, and that's all you need to know about it. Syria is a complex country in a very difficult neighborhood, which is the Middle East. Imagine living in the Middle East, where you have one of the most powerful states in the world, propped up by the most powerful state in the history of humanity, the United States, Israel, which is occupying part of your country. In the case of Syria, they're occupying the Golan Heights. Imagine trying to survive against them. The Israelis are receiving a budget of over, I don't know what the latest figures are.
I had them. Yeah.
Several billion every
Several
year.
billion a year, yeah.
Yeah, several billion every year, just in handouts from U.S. hardworking taxpayers. U.S. working class paying for a colony out in the Middle East they know nothing of, that doesn't serve their interests. It's scandalous. So the U.S. workers are paying for a colony out in the Middle East that is causing havoc in its region. Now, if you're Syria, you're trying to live with that, next to a colony like that, which is armed to the teeth, which is a nuclear power, the fourth biggest military power in the world, then you need to get watchtowers. You need to build big high fences. You need to spend at least 30% of your budget on the military, which is what the Syrian government had to do for decades. You need to have conscription. In other words, if there are psychopaths out in your garden and you've got kids, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to keep your kids inside the house, or are you going to go out in the garden with a machine gun and
deal with it.
supervise them while they're playing? Right? That's your choice. Deal with it. What are you going to do? In other words, that's what the people of Syria and most of the people who did not want to end up like the Palestinians had to do for decades. So it's very easy for us to preach to them about police states and state of emergency and so on. They really did have a state of emergency in Syria for years because they had unresolved issues with Israel, obviously, and they had to maintain, high security, and they all suffered from that. So when I was in Syria in 2011, I was there a couple of weeks after the war started, and the war started after unknown snipers opened fire on police in a pseudo-democratic demonstration in Dara, and basically it took off from that, and there were massive amounts of arms sent in from Iraq by the US, by the British, by the Europeans to destabilize the country.
Which nobody denies
around
now.
the country, you could see that this is a country under severe pressure, under all kinds of pressure, and we've never experienced that in Europe.
No.
If we had, then we'd understand their point of view.
And by the way, Gearòid, he was meeting his millennial goals, and he was a reformer. He was hailed as a reformer when he reluctantly took power after his brother died.
Look,
way back
Richie,
when. Can I just do this just before you come back in? I got to pay tribute to the tweets because I think we've had about 200 tweets, and I don't exaggerate. Folks, you can follow the tweets. It's Richie Allen Show, all one word. You put that in Twitter and press enter. You'll see everything. I just want to just mention a few of them because, we encourage them, so we don't want to ignore them. Dominic Blackburn says, this guy is mustard. That's a good thing, apparently, mustard. Gearòid, so you're mustard. Thanks for that, Dominic. It is good stuff tonight. I'm delighted with this. Wayne was on to say, I like this guy, Richie. He is balanced in the debate to me, and he understands it is the few who causes such pain. Well, he is very balanced. Claire was on to say, Gearòid is just a breath of fresh air, seemingly mainstream, but so bang on. This is excellent analysis. I want to say hi to Zana in New Zealand. How you doing, Zana? Sean McDonald, who says, what a terrific guest. Every time I read a tweet, I get a message saying another 20 notifications have come in on Twitter. Kirsten McCoy, how you doing, Kirsten? Gearòid Colmàin is on the ball and he's refreshing to listen to, she says. That's fantastic. I do appreciate that. By the way, I'll mention once again, it's gearoidocolmàin.org. Isn't that right, Gearòid?
Yeah,
that's the website.
Website on under construction. It should be out. Well, hopefully soon we'll get the archive up, and we're working hard at that at the moment to get it finished. So hopefully in the next week or so.
That's absolutely brilliant. 20 and a half minutes to the top of the hour. We've got about another 10 minutes max on this, so I'm going to quickly bring Gearòid back in. I won't get to too many more tweets or emails because I'll only be interrupting them, folks. But I do appreciate that. You might not get asked this very often. I know when you do television interviews, it's hard news and they want you to give an opinion on what you've seen. But I'm going to put this to you because of the type of programme it is. What's the solution, Gearòid? What can people do? They feel helpless. They listen to you and they're glad that somebody is speaking to their understanding of geopolitical events and what's really behind them. But they despair, feeling that we're utterly, utterly helpless and powerless to do anything about it. What do you think?
I think people need to abandon cynicism. That cynicism consists of saying, I suppose, that the world is ruled by evil people and there's nothing we can do about it, and they sit at kind of the top of the global pyramid, and there's nothing we can do about it, but and everything is kind of preordained. They need to see that there is the bottom line for social hope is a society that is at peace. That's the first thing. So a society that is at peace, but also to understand that to have peace, the system of production we live under. I mean, I call it, the system of production is capitalism. I see this as a technical thing called capitalism, the extraction of surplus value from labor, and that, multiplied by millions gives you what we have. That fight is something we're all involved in. We must try to link the fight of the ordinary citizen in Europe for his job, for his livelihood, for his pension, for his wages and so on, with the foreign wars. Those have been delinked, and that is a big problem. They don't see these foreign wars as being very much part of the kind of class war being waged by the ruling class against ordinary working people in Europe and America. So we need to understand the class element here in this, and understand that our struggle for social hope meaning some kind of sense of security, some sense that things are going to get better, that that we're not going to have to work for the rest of our lives just to pay our rent, that there's some sort of sense to our lives. Those things need to be brought together. We need also to see through facile notions of left and right, because as I've said in many occasions, the so-called left, what I call the petty bourgeois left, that is kind of Labour, Corbyn, Tsipras, and all that, they're very much promoting globalization. So, and also the far right are just as bad, because they're promoting racial identity politics. Both of those things are wrong. We need to see that the reality is somewhere in between. So we need to be subtle and dialectical in the way in which you understand reality. But I think knowledge will push us, into a better place. Knowledge really is the key here, and understanding the origin of this war and making the link between the class war in Britain, the class war in Europe, and the foreign wars of aggression and the state propaganda. We need to create our own media. We need to people need to disengage from the matrix and start listening to independent media and expressing themselves through the internet while they still can. And through that will acquire eventually critical mass. And once that acquires critical mass, the consensus will change. It's happening already. I can hear it almost every day in the French media. They're absolutely terrified of the independent media, and independent media views are invading the mainstream matrix all the time, to the point where even experts are starting to kind of have courage and starting to kind of say, look, we've got to stop this. We can't continue to kind of support Saudi Arabia and all these countries, and so it will have an impact, and it is having an impact. So I think that people need to get active, even if it's just posting something on Facebook, posting something on Twitter, telling somebody. People need to be just get active and get conscious. I think that will spread, and it already is spreading. And it's that is the only way that this can be stopped.
I think that's a brilliant way to leave it, my friend. I know you've had a really busy week. A number of people have tweeted genuinely, and you can read the tweets yourself, Gearòid, when you go on Twitter later on. They wish you were back in Ireland, that Ireland needs a good dose of investigative journalism right now. It really does. Gearòid's website, go ahead.
Richie, if the two of us were back in Ireland right now, I'm sure we'd be probably in the GPO, with M16 machine guns and Kalashnikovs.
Wouldn't it be nice? You know what kills me is the way you see Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael trying to hijack the centenary commemorations. Dreadful, isn't it? My God. Michael Collins would be turning in his grave if he could see what happened to Ireland,
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's another show. It's something you should. I hope you'll do something on that farce of of the centenary, because there's a lot of things to say about that. I mean, it was the 1916 Rising being such a symbolic event of oppressed people rising up against tyranny and imperialism. It's shameful that our government is very much in line with the imperialists and the colonialists nowadays. When our forefathers, ancestors, I mean, we experienced the very start of this in Ireland. In the start of the 19th century, when imperialism sent the black and tans into Ireland during the War of Independence, they were perhaps not as savage as ISIS, but they very much served the same purpose as ISIS. So it's it would be great to see a revival of that kind of that spirit in Ireland, which is sorely lacking, I think, today.
Listen, I just want to give out just very quick mention again. Gearòid's new website is gearòidocolmán.org. That's been tweeted out. I'll tweet it out again. He is the Parisian correspondent for the American Herald Tribune. Mate, thanks very much for giving us your time. I really enjoyed having you on.
Great talking to Richie.
Well, you have an open door, my friend. Anytime you want to come back, let us know. Don't wait to be called. Give us a shout, and you're welcome. Happy Easter to you, Gearòid.
Same to you, Richie.
And bye for now. God bless. Gearòid Colmàin on the line to us there from Paris.